Hello, everyone. This is your co-host, Stu, and I'm here with the paranormalist, Patty Wilson. Hi, Patty. How are you?
I'm doing fine, Stu. I understand you're feeling a little bit tired and sore. You were very busy this day.
I was simply because there was so much rain in the northeast of where we live, in the northeast U.S., the last couple of months. And so my weekend time, because I'm a working man, so the weekend time was really the only time I have to do the yard work. And yeah, I'm paying for it today. A little over 5 hours of quite heavy manual labor, which is not something I'm used to.
Well, I know that you are a person who, once you get started on a project, don't like to stop till you're done. So I'm sure it looks much better now.
Absolutely true. And yeah, the yard is all ready for winter now. So I'm happy about that. So
That's awesome.
um, for our viewers and listeners, if you're with us and you've you've stayed with us this far, you say, what the heck are they talking about? I want to hear ghosts. Please consider clicking the subscribe button that's down below. Click the bell to be notified when we release new content. In the description, you'll find a link for our link tree where you can find everything Paranormus related. And you'll also find the Buy Me a Coffee. And I do want to make it very apparent that if you are donating to the Buy Me a Coffee, it is not actually going to Stu's Coffee Fund. I have my own kitty for that, so don't worry about it. That is actually going to help the podcast. And I think that's it. I think I'm ready for you to tell us some ghost stories.
So as it's close to Halloween, I decided to get into some dangerous ghosts. Now, these are
Oh,
ghosts that have inspired great fear or physical harm.
when you say that, the first thing that went through my mind was the movie 13 Ghosts.
Oh.
Yeah. Have you seen that one?
I saw it years and years ago.
Yeah, there were a dozen of really, really, really nasty ghosts. Yeah. We going
Yes,
that
there
far?
were.
We
Well,
going?
we'll see. We'll see where we end up.
Okay. All right.
Okay. So my first story is going to be starting out a little bit gentle. And I'm going to tell you the story about a place called Jersey Shore, Pennsylvania. This is in Lycoming County in PA. And I thought this story was really kind of interesting. So Jersey Shore, in 1917, there was a huge fire. And it wiped out part of Main Street. Just a tragic, thing that happens and from time to time in different places. Now, the area was not known to be haunted prior to the fire. And it took quite a while for like the planning commissions and people to decide what they were going to do to rehabilitate the area and all of that. So this story actually takes place from 1917, the date of the fire, all the way through to 1920, which is when they begin to do reconstruction on that area. The area was not haunted, as I said. There were no particular ghost stories. I'm not saying that there might not have been somebody who knew a ghost story, but there was nothing popular or famous or anything like that in the region.
Okay.
And during the time after the fire, parts of this burned out area, only the burned out area, which was from South Main Street between Thompson Street and Smith Street out near the river, um, began to have people reporting bizarre stories. Now, this was a huge, huge fire. Like companies from all the little towns all around were called in. It was a big mess. But after everything had been burned out and they had started tearing all the stuff down, they began to notice a ghost that was tall and thin with a skull-like face that spit smoke and sparks as it floated. So
Ooh.
you can imagine, there's a work crew there and they're beginning to pull buildings down and, clean up the debris. And they see this. Now, not only do they see it, but it's very popular that it's seen sometime between midnight and 4 o'clock in the morning. So pedestrians walking through the area, people who lived nearby, all began reporting this bizarre phenomena. Now, I would have honestly thought at first that it was a guy in a suit, except for the fact that it was floating and it was spitting sparks and smoke.
Yeah, not really guy-like behavior. Yeah.
Well, and the thing about that is like we're talking 1917, so we're not talking an era where we have all the effects we have today. That would have been pretty hard to make up. The other thing that was seen, and this is why they say there maybe have been more than one ghost, is that there was another ghost seen wearing white robes that sparkled in the night, and at times a cloaked figure with arms made of fire. So that's at least 3 separate entities seen in that area. And I thought it was fascinating because, first of all, as I said, it's really difficult to imagine that people could have pulled off those kinds of effects. Arms made out of pillars of fire, stuff like that. It's really difficult to imagine in 1917. And then they talk about seeing shadows moving across the burned walls, dodging in and out through alleys, and then they would see things stretched with outstretched arms, like the fire figure moving through. They have to this day no idea what caused it. Now, here's the other interesting component. They make a point of saying in this article that there were no known deaths during the fire. Because you might have thought, hey, maybe somebody died in the fire and that this was a bizarre way to show their haunting, but that's what it is. They don't know, and this scared many people throughout the region over the course of that couple years while they were trying to do the rehabilitation of the area. When the new buildings began to come up, it began to slack off. And people who claimed they were terrorized and frightened, they started saying that they weren't seeing anything anymore. So what it was and why it was there, or they were there, if there were 3, nobody honestly knows. It's just this really bizarre thing. And I cannot imagine you're walking home and you have to go along the edge of the burned out area, after work at 11 o'clock at night or something like that. And you see one of those 3 figures flitting along in front of you, moving like a shadow across the walls and then coming out of the walls at you as if confronting you. I can't even imagine. But this was reported time and time again. In fact, there was a court case over this where a person went to court and demanded that the police do something. They were so convinced it had to somehow be a human being. And the court ordered the police to look into it, and the police they saw things, but they could not catch anything. So a very creepy story.
Yeah, trying to figure out, just what, so was the cause of the fire known?
It was, to the best of my ability to tell from the articles I've read, it was just a fire sparked by negligence in one of the buildings. Somebody, wasn't paying attention and left something running, and it shorted out.
Yeah, my mind went to, potentially malevolent entities starting the fire, but then why would they just taper off after the buildings were rebuilt? That's just completely bizarre. Yeah.
It is, and I can't explain it. So this was just kind of a disconcerting story, but the next story is going to get into some serious creepy. There just is no way around it. So most people have at least once or twice heard of something called Bobby Mackey's Music World. So in 1978, Bobby Mackey was a country music singer. He was regionally very famous. And he took his money and decided to buy a building and make what he called Bobby Mackey's Music World. So it was going to be a restaurant, a bar. He was going to perform in it. It was like a one-stop shop where he could make a living the rest of his life doing what he enjoyed doing. And, he can continue to perform his music while taking care of his family. But the place he chose to buy is what ends up creating all the drama for Bobby Mackey and his family. The place he bought actually had been a slaughterhouse in the 1850s and had been renovated into a bar and restaurant over the course of time. There's a very deep well in the basement of the building, and the well actually bled out into what was known in the area as is called Licking River. It had been abandoned for about 40 years, putting it back to its last occupation being in the 1940s. That becomes important later on in our story. So anyhow, he looked at the place. It looked, pretty easily repaired. He figured I could put the money into it. This place has everything I'm looking for. It had a great big stage area, a great big dance floor area. It had an area he could renovate into a bar/restaurant. All of it in this great big open space. So you could be at the bar, in the restaurant, and still see the dancers and still see Bobby Mackey performing. So it had pretty much everything he wanted. And it wasn't all that expensive because obviously it had been abandoned for 40 years and needed some renovations. So he buys the place, despite the fact that when his wife goes through it with him, she tells him there's just something awful about this place and I don't think it's a good idea. But it's cheap and it's exactly the kind of layout he wants. So he buys it. However, later he will come to learn a lot about the property itself, the whole property, the grounds, the building, that are going to make this one of the creepiest stories you'll have ever heard in your life. So he buys the place. He begins to do renovations. His wife she's trying to help. It's really him and his wife and a caretaker he hires named Carl. And Carl had lived in the area his whole life. He had some history of working in other bars, and he got hired to do this. And part of his wages is that he would sleep in the upstairs of the bar in a series of little rooms that kind of he turned into an apartment. Now, Bobby Mackey's wife is pregnant at the time, and she's, painting, and in the early 80s, just for those who don't know, we didn't know that you couldn't paint when you were pregnant. So she's painting and putting up wallpaper and helping Carl, and things are going on, and Bobby Mackey's working and coming in the afternoons and evenings and doing what he can because he's still got to, pay the bills for the place. So he's working as a performer elsewhere. And he gets to start to hear these stories, these bizarre stories from his wife and Carl about, Carl was on a ladder and the ladder started jumping up and down across the floor and he fell and he got hurt. There's a story that his wife tells him about how she was painting and all of a sudden a ladder came flying at her, smacked into her, and injured her badly.
Wow.
And Carl was on the other side of the room where she could clearly see him. They would hear footsteps, they would hear crying, they would hear screams, they would hear all kinds of bizarre noises, thumping, pounding, doors opening, closing, slamming, things being picked up and thrown. And Bobby Mackey rolled his eyes and said, "You guys read too many ghost stories." Even the injury made him say, "You guys read too many ghost stories." The ladder slipped and fell. The rest of it was imagination. That kind of stuff. He wasn't buying it.
Even then, he didn't listen to his wife.
No, not even when she was injured. He thought it was crazy. Well, over the course of time, things get really, really bad. So they make it through this bizarre renovation period, and he gets the bar up and running, the stage is working, the restaurant part's going, and he starts to have guests coming in. It's like a twangy, honky tonky kind of cool place. It's really popular. And that's when the next level of hauntings go on. Now, at the same time, Carl's still renovating parts of this building. So he's renovating on the 3rd floor. He's renovating basement area. And that's where he stumbles across, while he's fixing flooring, there's a walled off, closed off well. And as he's fixing the flooring, he realizes that the flooring's weak in this area, most likely because of the water, the dampness rotting the wood. And he decides to pull the wood up, figure out how to cap this well, which he just thinks of as a well in an old building. And that's when it gets insane. So now they hear voices coming out of the well. There's all kinds of insanity going on in the bar area. there is a man who goes to the restroom, and he goes to wash his hands, and a man comes up through the mirror. He's looks like he's from the mid 1800s. He's young. He's got his hair slicked back and a little mustache, and he says, "I'm going to kill you." And at that point, a garbage can picks itself up and throws itself with great force at the man. And he comes running out of the restroom. He's injured, and he's telling this bizarre story. And the thing is, he's not the first guy who claims to have seen that figure in the men's restroom. And Carl has described him, and Bobby Mackey's wife has described him. And then Bobby Mackey's wife, who had stayed out of the bar a good bit of the time because of the injuries she had received, and she was afraid she was going to lose the baby. She comes back after the baby's born, and she starts having these experiences too. And this is when they start doing research on the property. This is the first thing they find. In 1896, the headless body of a young woman by the name of Pearl Bryan was found in a field near the slaughterhouse. Pearl Bryan had gone missing from town a few days earlier, and that was known that she was hanging out with one of the local young guys, a guy named Alonzo Whaley, and his friend Scott Jackson. Well, Scott Jackson had been Pearl's boyfriend at the time, and when she had confronted him and told him that she was pregnant, something had happened. There is still some speculation on exactly how whatever happened. We know that the two men were dental students planning to become dentists, and that they had the ability to lay their hands on chloroform and things like this. So it is speculated, and frankly, to be honest, hoped that it happened this way. If it didn't, it was a lot more gruesome. That they put Pearl Bryan to sleep and then cut her head off, threw her head in the well, and then took her decapitated body and drug it into a field nearby. There is very little doubt that she was murdered in that basement, because when the police finally began to figure out the whole thing, they went to that basement, in which they found blood spattered all over the walls, meaning that Pearl was alive when she was decapitated. And they found in the basement as well, in the center around that well, a pentagram drawn in blood. So there is speculation that it wasn't just because she was pregnant, but that they were into some really dark stuff. And the men finally confessed to the murders, and they said that they were glad they had done it. And right before they're executed, this is what Alonzo said, his last words: "I will forever haunt this land as revenge for my unjust death." Even though he said he did it, he felt that he had a right to do it, or that it was okay to do it. And it is believed that that ritual, whatever it was, and the fact that they threw her head into that well, may have opened some sort of a portal and started a lot of this terrible stuff. So then the slaughter yard has a bad reputation. You can imagine nobody wants to work there. It's a horrible thing. The last thing you want to say is that you buy your meat from the place where Pearl Bryan's head was found. So the guy, shuts it down, and it becomes vacant. In the 1950s, it's purchased and turned into a bar for the first time. It's called the Latin Quarter in that time. And there was a lot of illegal activity that went on. Not only was there a lot of music, but there was prostitution and things like that going on in this Latin Quarter bar. Now, at the time, there was a young man by the name of Robert Randall, who fell in love with one of the young ladies who worked at the bar. Her name was Johanna, and her father intervened in the relationship and he was one of the gangsters that was running drugs and running booze and what have you. And he killed Robert Randall because he wouldn't leave Johanna alone. There is actually to this day a poem that's scratched onto the wall. They found it when they were doing the renovations, and it was supposedly written by Johanna, and it's kind of a love, an ode to Robert Randall. And then Johanna attempted to poison her father to death, and after she gave her father the poison, which she survived, she committed suicide. She was found in the basement on top of the area which would later be discovered to be the place where that well was at. And it is believed she also haunts the building. Now, with this kind of horrible torment and activity, you can understand why it would have a bad reputation. The Latin Quarter bar went out of business, and it sort of sat there until Bobby Mackey discovered it. And he began to, redo the place, and apparently disturbed all of this stuff. There are some really interesting photographs that have surfaced from ghost hunters and people there. But the beginning of this whole thing was the early 1980s, and people weren't ghost hunting like they are today. So the first 10 years of what happened here actually was, eyewitness accounts. And all of this culminated with him getting sued. Bobby Mackey got sued because of that man who got injured whenever the garbage can flew and hit him in the head. Mm-hmm. And he actually sued for damages. And the fact of the matter is he won, because everybody knew the place was haunted. Everybody had their stories. Bobby Mackey's wife had gone to the hospital repeatedly. She had been clawed by something that ripped her back open. She had been pushed down the stairs. There had been suspicions that Bobby Mackey was abusing her, but it happened even when he was out of the area. Contractors fixing the old place had been slapped in the face. They had been scratched. They had been knocked down. Men had been picked up and thrown across rooms. They had heavy furniture thrown at them. There are stories about, at the beginning, when they started getting the tables and chairs in, they had them all set down, ready to go, and they heard this horrible thunderous thumping, and Carl and Bobby Mackey's wife and the contractor who had come in to help with sorting all this out turned around, and all the chairs were precariously piled on top of the tables, done in about 30 seconds. Something that you just simply physically can't do. They would hear something, it sounded like a body being dragged across the floors when there was nobody else in the building. Apparitions were seen. There were blood-curdling screams from the basement and up in the third floor. And the basement is to this day kind of open. Bobby Mackey now actually courts ghost hunters and has them come in and check out the place because it's had such a reputation. But when it came up at the beginning, it was a one-of-a-kind story. I remember back when this first came out, Sally Jesse Raphael and Phil Donahue interviewed them. And
oh my. Yeah.
I'm serious. That's how far back we're going. And, Bobby Mackey's sitting there with his 10-gallon cowboy hat and his spurred boots, and he's telling them, well, no, this is their imagination. And Carl's sitting on the stage, and Mackey's wife is sitting on the stage. And he's like, I'm not saying they're liars. I'm just saying they're embellishing. It has to be embellishing. But it made this guy really well to do. But the truth is, these stories are real. People have been injured, some of them severely. Bobby Mackey's wife eventually refused to go back into the building. She had been injured so many times. And it's just an amazing story if you're looking for those kinds of stories. And I just thought it was a fascinating tale. It's not talked about so much anymore, except like ghost hunters know about it because like you can go down and spend the night in Bobby Mackey's basement with the portal from hell, which I have actually turned down doing. I had a really good friend who said he was going for a weekend and he
Mhm.
wanted me to come. And I told him, I said, I have horrible feelings about that place. That's just one place I don't want to go.
And I don't blame you. And I find that really interesting that the man injured by the garbage can won the case. That would stand to reason then that the judiciary admitted that the supernatural exists.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, he sued him. Carl, I believe, sued him at one point, and that's when he finally quit his job because the injuries have become so numerous. There's just this was so well known by patrons, and other patrons had had similar experiences. It wasn't hard to get people to come in and say, "Dude ain't crazy, man. Let me tell you what happened to me." And
And,
it's not often that the judge would listen to that, but like this was multiple people.
and even after all of that, why would Bobby Mackey just be a staunch disbeliever in all of that?
I
I
think
don't,
because he put all his life savings into it. And if at the beginning the thought was this was going to ruin him. He literally spent everything he had. He mortgaged everything he could. Like he did one of those do or die kind of things. And he didn't want it to be so.
Mhm.
And it was only later in later years that he realized that he had a marketable tool. But at the beginning, he shot everything down right and left. So I just thought that was a fascinating story, and then I wanted to share that. Now I want to go a little further abroad for this next story. So this is actually from Thailand, and it came out of a newspaper article from Thailand. There is it says villagers say a ghost killed 10 healthy men. So the story is that there was a ghost that they called the widow. She appears all in white. She would appear to single men who were only children of a couple, and it was always only children, and they would begin to be haunted by her, and then they would start to get sick and they would eventually die, and it would be very sudden. Like they would be scared, they would be talking about seeing her. She's in a white gown. Sometimes they said she had a veil over her face, and she would appear, she would touch them, um, and just terrify them. I don't know how else to explain her. She's terrorizing them. And then their parents would go into the building, into the bedroom one day, and they would just be like in this rictus of terror and dead, frozen there, like a sudden death syndrome or something. Now, it sounds crazy, but widow ghosts, um, they're called Leotaya spirits, have often been known to claim healthy young men. And in this particular instance, over the years, there are several villages around the same region, some of which were people who didn't know anything about each other or what was going on, who all reported very similar incidents. And it doesn't happen just there. Um, it's happened in other parts of the world, slightly different connotation, but when this spirit appears, then it actually steals their essence, kills them. And they're never injured. There's not a single wound or, anything that could cause them to die. They just are dead of fear or a heart attack.
Hmm.
And presumably healthy young men.
Yeah, my mind went immediately to a succubus.
Yeah,
But
very much like that.
mhm.
And it would be one thing if you heard a couple stories or a little bit of folklore, but there were 10 families over about a 15-year period who all reported the same series of events just prior to the death of their sons. And they didn't all know each other. These came from different towns in the region. And so it was a reporter who began to hear these stories, and he started gathering them. And that's when he realized how significant it was, that it wasn't just one or two stories. It was literally 10 families from multiple areas who've all had the same experience, and they weren't talking about it publicly. So it wasn't like a contagion where, you kind of pick it up. And he did the interviews, and he is the one who began to realize that this very much fit a local and national story theme. We would call it the La Lorna, I can't talk today, or a succubus. And they have a different name for it, but it's very much the same thing.
I'm glad I'm one of 4 children.
Yes. In that instance, I don't blame you. So I wanted to talk about Alcatraz Island. There are literally a half dozen or more ghosts, but there's one in particular that I thought was of interest in this particular time frame. So in the night, they have a hole. They had several holes that they would put people in. Basically, they are an area where you would be isolated for supposedly 1 to 3 or 4 days, which is in and of itself pretty terrible. If you can imagine sitting in the dark in a cold, damp cell, really your sensory deprivation is going on. You aren't allowed to talk. You can't see anything because it's dark, it's cold, it's damp. You don't have any blankets. You don't have any mat to lay on. And if you get fed, it's bread and water mostly. And that's exactly what it was like. There was one cell in particular called cell 14D that ended up having a ferocious reputation. So cell 14D, that was a place that was like the worst of all of them. It was the darkest, dampest, nastiest. People would go in there and they'd be stuck in there for not just hours or days, but weeks in this horrible place. And that was actually against the law, but they didn't, who are you going to tell? You're in Alcatraz prison. Who are you going to tell? And who cares? Anyhow, so there was the cell 14D, and supposedly people believed it was haunted. It was haunted by a man who died there in the 1940s. He was found strangled on the floor of the room, and he had been begging the guards to let him out because somebody was in there with him who was going to kill him. He kept screaming, "Get me out, get me out. The creature with the glowing eyes is going to kill me. Get me out, get me out." And the guards ignored him. And, and I know that there are stories where people spoke about things like this as a ploy to get out of their prison cells. But in this instance, when the guards went to check on him the next morning, he was strangled. Now, you can obviously make the most obvious conclusion, which is that maybe one of the guards strangled him to shut him up, or put another inmate in there to strangle him to shut him up. And I can't tell you that that didn't happen, because I don't have any ability to prove that it didn't happen. I can only tell you that subsequent to this man's death, multiple other people, even most of whom did not know the story because it wasn't well known. It was, it's a transient population at best. And also other people had seen this being with the glowing eyes, or they saw a man in the cell who seemed to be terrified and was begging them for help, which makes me wonder if that man who was strangled is still stuck there, not aware he can get out. And if that's the case, that's horrendous.
Well, also horrendous is, if the story got out, the only people there would be the guards to hear this man saying that there was the being with the glowing eyes.
Yeah.
One of those guards had to tell the story for us to be hearing it right now.
Yeah, the guards have told the story. Other prisoners who've been in the area have told the story, have heard it. People who survived being in there have come out of there and told the story. It's quite a frightening tale if you think about it. And like I said, there are other stories. Capone ordered the hit with the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, and unbeknownst to him, the day of the massacre, and actually at the moment of the massacre, his brother-in-law was there, and he didn't realize he would be there that day, and he got killed in the massacre. And Capone would claim for the rest of his life that his brother-in-law haunted him. It started when he was at Eastern State Penitentiary. He began talking about it, and up through him being in the same prison that we were just speaking about at Alcatraz. There's arguments that his brain was going because of syphilis, and indeed he did have syphilis, but it wasn't advanced when he started talking about his brother-in-law haunting him at Eastern State. It was years later that it had gone untreated that it began to eat at his brain. But on all the way through the rest of his life, he believed his brother-in-law haunted him because he had him murdered. Now, the next story is interesting because this place has become very popular among ghost hunters. So a lot of people will recognize the Villisca Axe Murder House. So basically, the story is that in 1912, this family was living in this house, and there were 6 children in the house that night and 2 adults on the night of the murders. I believe there were their 4 kids and 2 other children, relatives, friends of the family that were staying over that night. While they were asleep in their beds, somebody broke into the building and crushed their skulls with an axe and killed them all. This is a true story. This did happen. It was a complete mystery. There's still a lot of speculation as to who committed the murders and why. It didn't seem to make any sense. There was nothing stolen. They weren't rich or well-to-do. There was no gossip about them doing anything that would make anybody angry or vengeful. Nothing. There were rumors about a hobo, but it's the time frame as well. There were a lot of people, hobos around, and what have you. But there's never been any real resolution. Now, the house sat for a long time. There's been periods of time people lived in it and people didn't live in it. Then it became well known again as the Villisca Axe Murder House, and a woman purchased it and she refurbished it exactly as it would have been at the time of the murders. And then she rented it for ghost hunters to come in.
All right, nothing good can come of this. I can tell.
Yeah. So her name was Martha Lynn, and she was 77 years old, and she said that, she saw it as a business opportunity, frankly. So it was restored exactly as it was, all the electricity taken out, all the plumbing removed, make it exactly as it had been during that time period. That's kind of important from a ghost hunter's point of view because there should have been no EMF fields in it. People paid up to $450 a night to spend a night there, if you can imagine. And there's been a lot of EVP sessions, there's been Ouija boards, there's Geiger counters used. One of the original axes from the murders was brought into the house. Now, one of the ghost hunters who went there, his name was Robert Stephen Larson Jr. He's 37 years old from Rhinelander, Wisconsin, was a visitor who decided to go ghost hunting. He and his friends had what they called a recreational paranormal group. They were like the people that go out and you just look for different haunted spots and check them out and see what you can find. A lot of ghost hunters are that way. And they decided to go in. Now, according to Sheriff Joe Sampson from Montgomery County, the county where this house sits, from his understanding, Robert Lawson was alone in the northwest bedroom of the property, and the rest of his group were in other areas when he began to call for help on the two-way radios. Every ghost hunting group has them, it's part of the gear you carry. And he started to, of course, people were coming in, running in to see him, and like if you want to see a group of people who are dedicated to taking care of each other, I promise you, ghost hunters who have hung out together for years and years, they're as tight as military command. They just are. So when he starts screaming, I need help, I need help, I need help, they're pouring in from wherever they're at. To their absolute shock, he has been stabbed in the chest. And it very quickly becomes apparent it was a self-inflicted injury. They call 911, they get him help. He's life flighted to a hospital, and of course the police are called, a report is opened, and they kind of look at this whole thing and they're like, did he get overcome with the drama, or what happened? He admits he did it himself, but he says something overtook his body and forced him to stab himself. And when he realized what had happened, that he couldn't fight it and he had stabbed himself, whatever it was left go of him, and that's when he grabbed the radio and started screaming he needed help. It's quite a tale.
Yeah, I won't be investigating there, thank you.
You know what? I've also had same friend had offered me an opportunity to go there. There are 3 places I have avoided: the Lizzie Borden house, and only because I honestly don't. I think there's too much hype about it. The Villisca axe murder house, because I don't think you should be making money off of a tragedy like that. And you could do a lot of damage. Obviously, there's been a lot of stuff happen in this building because there's people bringing Ouija boards in and all kinds of things. So I don't know what's in that house, but I thought this was an interesting story because the guy admits he did it, but he also says something grabbed his hand, made him do it, and then left go of him, and at which point he was able to grab the radio instead and beg for help.
Well, at least it wasn't fatal.
No, but it very well could have been if he hadn't been able to get help soon.
Oh, true. Yeah.
And the police, they looked at him for mental health problems, his paranormal group. They said he was never a drama queen. He was like the guy that was always with the equipment. Like, there's the 3 groups of people in a paranormal group. There's the guys that kind of control everything. They like to do the history and that stuff. Then there's the people that do the psychic stuff, and then there's the techies, and they're like all about the instruments. He was an all about the instruments guy. Yeah, I mean that's the 3 groups of people that ghost hunt, and every team usually has some configuration of those 3 groups of people, and there's no explanation. He never attempted suicide prior. He's never attempted it since. No mental health problems, no financial or emotional things going on. He wasn't profiting from it in any way. And those who knew him couldn't believe this had happened. So it's an interesting story from that perspective.
Very much so.
So did somebody in the house, spirit-wise, attempt to kill him? I don't know. Now, the next story we have touched on before, but you can't go through a series of stories like these without touching on it very briefly. So this is the Greenbrier Ghost from West Virginia. So the basic gist of the story is that in Greenbrier County, West Virginia, there was a young lady by the name of Elva Zana Heister. And she fell in love in 1897 with a young man named Edward Shue, who was the town's blacksmith. And they got married, and life seemed to be okay until one day Edward was at the blacksmith shop, and he went to the apothecary, the drugstore in town, ordered some medicine, and asked if they could deliver it to the house because Zana had a really bad headache and had had it for a couple days, and he was concerned about her. So the druggist sent the 12, 13-year-old boy who worked for him with the bottle of medicine to Zana's house, where he knocked on the door, didn't get any answers, opened the door, called into the house, waiting for Zana to answer, then decided to take it in and lay it on the table because it was already paid for by Edward. And that's when he found the body of Zana on the ground. And Edward made a big show out of being devastated. He refused to allow her family to have anything to do with the funeral. He put this great big scarf around her neck, and her mother was like, she never wore anything like that. He's like, she loved this scarf so much. And it puzzled Mom. And the upshot of the whole thing is Mom began to suspect that Zana was murdered. Why Zana was murdered, she wasn't sure. And then she goes to the district attorney and tells this insane story that for 3 or 4 nights previous, Zana had been appearing to her in her bedroom and telling her that Edward murdered her. He strangled her. And she was wearing that big bushy scarf that was around her neck. And she unwrapped it and her head fell sideways and you could see the handprints on her throat. Well, this mother was not to be quelled. She nagged the bejeebers out of this district attorney until he finally agreed to exhume the body. The body had already previously been examined by an undertaker and a doctor, and they had said it was natural causes. The upshot of the story is she had been strangled. The undertaker and the doctor were friends of Edward's who were hiding the whole story. And based upon her mother's testimony of what Zana told her after she died, Edward went to prison for the rest of his life. So literally, her mother repeated the words she claimed she heard from her dead daughter, and those words are what got him convicted. So I have one last story, and I saved it. This is my favorite one out of the whole group.
All right.
So this is called The Curse of the Chain Strangler. And it's not one of those stories that you would anticipate. So this is a story of a guy by the name of Carl Pruitt. He was just an average Joe, and he had a wife and he had a job and he was a common laborer, but he was managing. He had a little car and and he had a little tiny apartment, and the year is 1938. Now, Carl loved his wife a lot, and one day he surprised her by coming home early from work. But she surprised him more because she was in bed with another man. Carl freaked out. The dude jumped out a window, literally, and took off running, and Carl killed his wife by strangling her with a length of chain that had been laying on a chair in the kitchen when he came in. He had, I don't know what it was laying there for, but there it had been, and it was handy, and that's what he did.
All right.
So, and this took place in Pulaski County, Kentucky. So Carl commits suicide after he murders his wife and he realizes what he's done. He killed her. He's going to prison. He doesn't want to deal with this, so he commits suicide. Now, it is the guy came forward that had been having the affair. He told the police everything, and that's how they know really what all happened and why. So her family is really upset, and they don't want Carl buried in the same cemetery with their dead daughter because he was her murderer. So it's decided that Carl's family will bury him in the next town over, and his wife will be buried in the local cemetery where all her family is. And that should have been the end of it, except that about 2 years later, a group of teenage boys came to the local cemetery where Carl is at because the story had spread through town that this shadowy markings had been developing on the tombstone of Carl's grave that when they finally developed all the way appeared to be the links of a chain. Well, it was an oddity, and it was enough to drag some teenage boys out. So they rode their bikes over to the cemetery, and they're checking it out, and it's really weird. And one of the boys picks up a some stones, and he starts chucking them at the tombstone, Carl's tombstone. And he chips a little chunk off the edge of the tombstone. And somebody's like, "Oh, you're in trouble now, dude." So they all jump on their bikes and they ride out. Now, this is what makes this insane story. So the boy is riding his bike home. He's in a bizarre accident in which the chain of his bike comes off and somehow wraps around his throat and strangles him to death.
Huh.
What a strange coincidence. It didn't take long for the local townspeople to think, this is interesting. We got a dude who murdered his wife with a chain. Now, the kid who chipped his tombstone, and I'm sure all the other boys were more than willing to tell their part of the tale, is now strangled with a chain from his bike. So his mom hears the story eventually. She's devastated. She's just lost her son. She goes over and she decides to attack the tombstone with an axe. And she's whacking at the tombstone. Somebody comes along and they like pull her off and they're like, "Get a grip, lady, calm down. We understand, but it's just a bunch of folklore. You've got to let it go." So she goes home and I'm sure she tries to calm down. And, the next day, the neighbors look out the window and she's hanging off the clothesline. And I don't mean she cut the clothesline and she is hanging with the rope. I'm saying there's a basket of clean laundry laying on the ground and 2 pieces of clothesline from the 2 lines that were going up through her yard wrapped around her throat somehow and strangled her to death.
Not a chain.
Not a chain,
okay.
But pretty interesting because she's also strangled. So now the story spreads far and wide. Carl Pruitt came back from the dead. He murdered the boy and then the mother. Well, the story is sensational and people would go by and the local town cops had to keep shushing them out. And 2 of the local cops that were ordered to sort of survey the cemetery to keep everybody at bay go in and they take a series of photographs at the grave, like cheesy photographs making fun of the whole story and like pointing at the grave and the whole
my
nine.
eyes are rolling. Yeah.
Okay. And they get back in their car and they're going down the road when they notice this big ball of white light, like out of nowhere, zooming at them from behind. And the cops are like, "Oh my God, it's Carl Pruitt's spirit." So they begin driving faster and wild, and they're driving faster and wilder and faster and wilder and faster and wilder, whirling alongside, sideways across the turns and just going insane. And they end up smashing into this big fence. And the one guy gets thrown clear, and the other guy is found with a piece of chain wrapped around his throat behind the steering wheel. Nobody can explain how this happened. The cop that survives sits down and tells everybody the whole story, right? And it's horrendous. Now, everybody in town knows about it. Everybody in the whole region knows about the story of Carl Pruitt, the chain strangler. So for a couple years, people avoid the cemetery. They just stay out of the area. And a guy who we have no idea why he did it because he had no connection to the story. But this dude wakes up one day and he decides he's going to take on Carl Pruitt. So he grabs a hammer and he's going to smash the tombstone to pieces because that's the only way that you're going to get rid of Carl. I don't know why that made sense to him, but it did. So he goes to the cemetery and he begins pounding on this tombstone with this great big hammer and smashing at it. People see it and they're like, somebody should call the cops. They call the cops, and when the cops get there, they find the guy at the gates to the cemetery, and they realize he had broken the chain on the gates of the cemetery to get in by smashing him with a hammer, and he's laying there dead at the gates of the cemetery, choked by the chain he had broken to get into the cemetery. Carl Pruitt strikes again. So the town's got to figure out what to do because Carl's like cracking them up right and left. And they decide the best thing to do is to move his body one place and his tombstone someplace else. Maybe for some reason, if they separate the two, it'll work out. He won't be able to generate whatever it is he's doing to kill people. So they dig up old Carl and they bury him elsewhere, and they either smash his tombstone or bury it someplace else because it disappears. To this day, nobody knows where it went. So Carl apparently, if he's separated from his tombstone, wasn't able to murder any more of the townspeople, and he finally found some peace, or at least he's not able to wreak havoc on the world anymore. And Carl Pruitt is laying either very frustrated or at peace in the ground in an unmarked grave somewhere in that county in Kentucky, or so goes the tale. And I think that is like my favorite ghost story I've heard in years.
And you know, I used to like Kentucky. You know, that was a one of our best vacations. I mean, it was quite a while ago now. Was to Cave Country or Cave County, Mammoth Cave, and there's all kinds of caves there. We really enjoyed that vacation, but we even thought about moving there after retirement. But since we don't know where Carl is, nope. Another state off the list. Thanks.
We no. We do know the county he's in.
Oh, okay.
So as long as you avoid that county, you're good.
Okay. All right. So you can tell me off camera.
Yeah. No, it's really simple. Now I have to tell you, I literally have 30 more stories of bizarre ghost hauntings like this. So if folks want to hear more of them, let me know. But just as it's almost Halloween, I really wanted to point out that the dead don't always stay dead, and it's not just hauntings. They always tell you ghosts can't hurt you. Well, in these cases, they can.
Well, as we're recording this will be the last episode before Halloween. So if all goes to plan, this episode will be released on Friday, October 27th.
Yes.
So pretty close.
Yep. So for all of you who enjoy a good ghostly tale and a little shiver, happy Halloween. And I have to tell you, each and every one of these stories are historical and have some documentation behind them. So don't always believe that ghosts won't hurt you. And you ghost hunters, be a little careful where you go, because obviously some of the dead are out to get you. Happy Halloween, everybody.
Okay. Good thing for editing. Man. All right. So